I think to respond to all the speakers would require a good 20 minutes of anybody in the audience, and you're going to restrict us each to probably no more than 2 minutes. So I'll be as brief as is possible.
Brief is good.
In the light of
In
light of the provocation from all the speakers, it seems to me that they are all engaging in wishful thinking that, in the Obama phrase, yes, we can, we bloody well can't, and we should stop deceiving ourselves in believing that, yes, we can. Any further burning of fossil fuels is intensifying the nature of the problem that we're attempting to deal with. If any of you have the common sense to look at the Global Commons Institute's website with its development of the concept of carbon budget allocation tool, CBAT, you will see in it, with any carbon budget, global carbon budget, the consequences in terms of sea level rise, in terms of temperature rise, in terms of the spread of economic damages, in terms of the so much.
I honestly think this audience knows those kind of consequences. But do you have a question for the panel?
Yes.
Because we have others to come in.
Yes, okay. I mean, you don't know how this tortures me to restrict myself to one question.
Yourself,
but
get to that question.
I'll have a key question for all of you, which is, and if you're unable to answer it, then you really better reconsider your positions. Namely, what possible means are there now of reversing the process which is melting the Arctic ice cap and accelerating at the same time due to feedback mechanisms which have not been mentioned at all, and which explains why it is now insufficient to talk about carbon reduction, which is a phrase which totally distorts the meaning of what we're about, which is only reducing the increase in carbon reduction.
Okay, that's great. We've got that question. And could I just reiterate, please do ask a question. I know that lots of you will have lots of burning points, but please get to the question.
Thank you. Peter Greaves. Has the World Bank really explored the proposition that emissions could be controlled more effectively by looking upstream, i.e. as close as possible to the production of fossil fuels? This idea has been around for at least 7 years, and various people have been revisiting it. And this year, George Marshall, in his latest book, talks about it. He uses the phrase, the wellhead as opposed to the tailpipe. Naomi Klein has made the same point. That is my question. Thank you.
Okay, and there was one other one just here.
Hi, I'm Gabriela Moya from E3G. Just on looking at the title on Zero Carbon Future, thinking about 2100, I've heard in other discussions about geoengineering approaches in like a plan B. What if the governments and all these economical, political things don't work as fast as we need them? Have you considered any of these technological developments that I know some institutions are working on, but how are they? Do they play any role in when you think about the longer term? Do you have any of these geoengineering alternatives?
Okay, so that's great. So a couple, actually, the first and the last. What is Plan B? Was the last question. Geoengineering. A bit of a sense that actually we're just too late on the block about some of this entirely from the first question. And the wellhead, the production of fossil fuels. Stefan, do you want to maybe just quick answers to those, and others want to come in? Yep.
Yeah, so very briefly, first, there are a lot of things that are not reversible, and we have started a lot of them. Antarctic is not completely clear, but Greenland kind of seems to be a done deal over the next centuries. So there are a lot of irreversible changes, and that's why there's just no way we don't think about the adaptation process and how we make sure development is not only low carbon, but it's also resilient, point that Macon made in his remarks. So in the Climate Change and Poverty report, in fact, we focus a lot on how to make sure we can deal with this impact that we are just too late to avoid. In terms of technical solutions, one thing which is really important is almost all scenarios achieving the 2-degree targets have negative emissions in them, which is or is not within the geoengineering realm, depending on how you define it. But basically, the way it's done, there are two ways. One is to do biofuels by just growing bioenergy and then burning that into power plants with capture and sequestration. So you grow your plant by taking CO2 from the atmosphere and you put it back in the ground. And the second way is to create more and more forests, which you cannot do forever because we have a limited surface, but at least in a transient way, you can have negative emission by just changing land use. One thing, and that's what I wanted to the point I wanted to make on technologies, if we don't have negative emissions by the end of, by 2050 and beyond, the short-term strategy is completely different. Right now, all the short-term strategies are dependent on the assumption that we'll have negative emissions. And if there is a reason to invest a lot in pilot project for carbon capture and sequestration, it's not only to develop the technology. It's also because if we don't have that, we better know it soon to adjust the short-term strategy. And I think it's a point that few people are making, but there is really urgency to know if this is doable or not. And there are doubts, so we really need to work on this. And finally, there is all the more like science fiction-like geoengineering stuff, including solar radiation management. I started by doing climate science, and I've worked a little bit on this. And this is, how to put it nicely, ridiculous. So the problem we have is that people are thinking in terms of temperature. You're doing solar radiation management. You can bring the temperature back where it was, but it doesn't mean your precipitation patterns are the same. It doesn't mean your circulations are the same. And what we find is if you do this, for very simple physics reasons, you reduce precipitation a lot. So if your concern is about water availability, which might be most of the impact, then you might make everything worse. So you'll get the same global temperature, but you would magnify impacts. And also the uncertainty on this is really, really high. The big problem is one country alone can do it. It's super cheap. Just bring some sulfate in the atmosphere, can be done by anybody. So how do we manage, how do you make sure not one country decide to do it at one point is an open question, which is a topic of a lot of discussion.
Okay, can I just get a couple of quick other points from other panel members?
Well, Stefan's answered the first and third, I think, very well. On the upstream, it is absolutely rational to try and control greenhouse gases as far upstream as possible. Just get them out of the system, and then you don't need to apply many, many, many more kinds of measures further down as the molecules get dispersed. And it would be a very good idea to apply it at wellhead and to have a universal tax. The problem is that doing that in industries and in countries, most of the countries where oil and gas is produced, that is their source of revenue and that is their core economic interest. And therefore, expecting Saudi Arabia and to take on the global control of emissions by taxing at the wellhead be a pretty good strategy for them, but it isn't. So it's run into the problem of the political economy of where that gas and oil is produced, and which is why we've had to go much further downstream. But it's rational and logical. It runs up against the fact that people who owns the wellheads.
So can I just have another round of questions? So Sheila, yep.
Hi, Sheila. I'm loud. Hi, I'm Sheila Whitley. I'm a research fellow at ODI. I do a lot of work on fossil fuel subsidies and subsidy reform, and some of the sort of recommendations that are more general that you make in the report obviously are quite, they apply equally to sort of different reform paths. And one of the recommendations that we're starting to put out in work that we're doing with the new climate economy is around a whole-of-government approach. And so you were saying you have this challenge, especially with complementary measures, that you have to get the people within the World Bank who work on climate to speak with the people who work on social protection. And so I was wondering if you're starting to see, and others who are working in the kind of international climate space, and Emily who's working on INDCs, are you starting to see more whole-of-government approaches? Because you do need all these different ministries and departments working together to get this transformation. And if so, where it's happening, how is it happening? Or what are the sort of incentives to make it happen?
Okay, and there's one behind you. Yep, no, you.
Thank you very much. Vincent Gassana, I'm a journalist. I'm looking forward to reading the report, and I do apologize if my question has probably been answered in the report. It strikes me that it's a sort of an unwritten law of nature that, the more the country develops, the more environmentally friendly it becomes, and the more it becomes aware of the environment. Now, the World Bank understandably encourages developing countries to have greater economic growth. how is it possible at all to decouple the problem that if the countries are developing countries, they are likely not to want to look at environmental issues, things like carbon capture, until they've reached a degree of development that they feel then they can.
Okay, there was a question over here. Yeah. Over.
Hi there, Ken Boyce from Christian Aid. I was really interested in your reluctance to use the word losers in relation to this. And for us, I guess a big issue is the role of fossil fuel companies and their lobbying impact. This morning we saw a letter from the CEOs of Shell and BP talking about the need for a carbon price, but when you read between the lines, what they're really saying is they want to be very heavily involved in determining what that carbon price is. So I think you talked about the need to compensate the losers. So how do you view that in terms of how do we do that without allowing people like Shell or BP hijack the process of policy formulation?
Okay, great. So a couple of private sector and finance ones as well for Emily there. So do you want to quickly step in, Stefan, and then we'll go to Emily for some
Okay, I can just make a few points first on the link between climate and the other issues. I think it's very country specific, but things have improved a lot. And so the disaster risk management domain especially has made huge progress in linking climate change adaptation, disaster risk management, and social protection, because we find that social protection tools are just fantastic instruments to help people after a disaster and are a critical component of the package to manage disasters. So in Ethiopia, for instance, the food security package that they've put in place, which is a social protection instrument that's working always but can be scaled up in case of drought, has been working really well. After Haiyan in 2010 in the Philippines, the cash transfer program was used to transfer money to the people affected. But we have more and more of these cases that sometimes countries have been leading, and now it works so well that, I mean, a lot of what we do is to detect things that have worked well in a country and to try to bring that in other countries. We're doing that a lot, and by doing this, we create links and we start to work together. So, I mean, silos exist in all institutions, all governments, and so on. It's very difficult, but I think that the trend is positive. On the development and when countries start to get interested in this, I mean, you mentioned carbon capture and sequestration, which is maybe the only policy that has no co-benefits, because I mean, the only point of doing this is really to protect the climate. So I think this is something that in a kind of like natural way arrives late in countries' priority, only when their more pressing problems have been solved. I think it's a completely different story if you're thinking about energy access, for instance, or access to water. We know that poor people in developing countries are often paying much more than the average citizen water and energy, because they use low quality generators or batteries, because they use bottled water, because they don't have access to piped water and so on. And all of this, which is really the development challenge, is creating all these co-benefits where if you develop your infrastructures right, you can reduce the price people pay and reduce emissions at the same time. So the sequencing of things is very context specific, depends on the sectors, but it was all the topic of the inclusive green growth that we did 3 years ago, to just flag at different development stages where are the resources for co-benefits. And what we're saying in this report is countries must first look at these co-benefits without disregarding the long-term goal, because there are some things that, even if they are not co-benefit, they are costly, they are cheaper to do now than to do later. And deforestation and urban development are the two big examples. If you develop your city wrong, then you're stuck. And if you destroy your forest, it's very difficult to regrow them.
Can I, because
I'm very happy not to take the last question anyway.
Let me just go to Emily, and then we'll come to Ilmi on the last question.
Okay, just very quickly. I mean, I think this whole of government approach, it's so key, but it's also incredibly challenging. And I think, as Stefan said, I mean, it's the political economy within governments that reflects the wider political economy in a country. And so, trying to introduce any kind of policy really involves normally several ministries, and often, different ministries are trying to water down. And, from my experience, having worked in the UK government, trying to design particularly domestic policy, including the Green Investment Bank, a number of policies, a number of approaches have ended up being sort of watered down to the point where they're only able to deliver so much of what they may have been able to deliver had a whole of government been behind that approach. And I think that is one of the key challenges. And I think it very much should, I mean, this point about having a long-term goal and identifying, a long-term path, that should be one way in which you could work towards a whole of government approach. Unfortunately, politicians tend to work on 4 or 5 year cycles. So again, this long-term approach may not be feasible. I think on the carbon pricing and the oil industry, well, it gets back to the fact that carbon pricing may deliver a certain amount of change that may be relatively cheap. So a shift to gas, fuel switching to gas, that's what the oil industry is now advocating, because they are investing in gas now.
And just on that.
Yeah, I want to build right on that. I think one way to I'm very comfortable talking about winners and losers. Communications, I apologize. But I think part of the reason is that we have to be honest. The gentleman over here, you've come to other panels before and made exactly the same point. It's still a valid point. I think we do have to be realistic about the fact that a lot of climate damage is locked in. And realize our losses. Equally, on the flip side, but it doesn't mean that we stop talking about how to deal with the issue, because if we allow continued growth in emissions, it gets worse. So that's what we're here to talk about. And I think on the flip side, we also have to be realistic that when California started putting in place emission standards for cars, what did the auto industry in the US want to do? They said, well, wait a second, we want a national standard. We don't want a state-by-state standard. And it's the same principle globally, is that you start seeing carbon pricing in, what was it, Stefan, 39 national and 23 sub-national jurisdictions. It's like, oh my God, this is really happening. We better get an international price, and we better shape it. That's a good thing. One of the things we need to do is rethink who are the winners and losers. If you actually think about who is invested in, say, coal, the number of stakeholders who really definitely will lose out, absolutely, and under no circumstances win, are a very few families that run privately held coal production companies. There's also the entire financial sector that's invested in it, but they value liquidity. If you can make their interests not aligned with that particular sector, you win, and they're not losers. So we should think in a much more nuanced way about how we define winners and losers. One of the most successful examples of this on pollution abatement that I've seen, because climate change is basic mitigation is basically pollution abatement, is that Sweden, when trying to tackle NOx pollution in industry, actually what they did was they taxed NOxes, they created a fee against NOx emissions, and then they used the revenue from that to pay the highest performers in the sector, who basically benefited from having this fee structure because they already were high performers, even before the fee was put in place. So what did it do? It caused that industry to have a real split between the companies that were already way out ahead, who actually benefited from that fee structure and from the tax, and the laggards who suffered from it. Who was lobbying for it? The half of the industry that already could do it. Who was lobbying against it? The increasingly diminishing portion that saw the risk. So I think really an important part of this is redefining who the winners and losers are.
That's great. And on that note, I just want to hand over to Stefan, our lead author here, to give us his closing thoughts before we wrap up the panel for today.
Okay, I just wanted to make maybe 2 points. One is on how to compensate, and you mentioned it, and your question is also related to this. This is a very difficult thing to do, and in industrial policies we have also very bad examples of compensation that rewarded friends or interest groups for a long time without delivering any benefits. So this will not be an easy thing, and in the report we're trying to look at why it worked well in some places, and it's a lot linked to governance structure, having very clear sunset clause to make sure the people benefit from the compensation and not the people being compensated, basically. So just maybe in the way I put it, I did not emphasize enough that this was a difficult thing to do. But we have examples of countries who did it well. To conclude, I just want to say that I think the situation today compared with 5 or 10 years ago is so different in terms of cost, in terms of what's going on, in terms of policies, in terms of how we talk about the problem, that maybe in 20 or 30 years, we will just really wonder why we thought it was so difficult. And I was trying to compare that with big structural change in the past. I think when you start like in the 70-something to think about democracy, I mean, that was an achievement this one looks so easy compared to this. And it just took time, but we managed to do it. So, I mean, maybe we're also a bit scared of everything and we feel this will be much, much more difficult than it is. I think if 10 years ago I had said that the capacity, the new electricity generation capacity installed in 2014 would be more than 50% in renewable, people would have laughed at me also. And in the end, we're there. So I think we should not disregard the speed at which things are changing. And maybe what's the main obstacle today is that people feel that it's too difficult. But when we start doing it, just things get easier. So maybe I'm doing wishful thinking, I don't know. But that's at least one way of moving.
Or maybe you're a positive realist. So Stefan, Helga, Amelie Amin, Michael Jacobs and Ilmi Granov, thank you very much for the panel today. And I've been told that also there are some great copies of Ilmi's report outside. Our author is going to be around to chat, and there are also some nibbles to tempt you in case you need further tempting. Thank you very much.
Thank you.